Isaiah chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now will I sing to my well-beloved, a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard, that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. And I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry. Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. In mine ears, said the Lord of hosts, of a truth many houses shall be desolate, even great and fair, without inhabitant. Yea, 10 acres of vineyard shall yield one bath, and the seed of an homer shall yield an ephah. Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink, that continue until night, till wine inflame them. And the harp, and the viol, and the tabret, and the pipe, and the wine are in their feasts, but they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands. Therefore my people are gone into captivity, because they have no knowledge. And their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. Therefore hell hath enlarged herself, and opened her mouth without measure, and their glory, and their multitude, and their pomp, and he that rejoiceth shall descend into it. And the mean man shall be brought down, and the mighty man shall be humbled, and the eyes of the lofty shall be humbled. But the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment, and God that is holy shall be sanctified in righteousness. Then shall the lambs feed after their manner, and the waste places of the fat ones shall strangers eat. Woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin as it were with a cart rope, that say, Let him make speed and hasten his work, that we may see it, and let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw nigh and come, that we may know it. Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, that put darkness for light, and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes, and prudent in their own sight. Woe unto them that are mighty to drink wine, and men of strength to mingle strong drink, which justify the wicked for reward, and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. Therefore, as the fire devoureth the stubble, and the flame consumeth the chaff, so their root shall be as rottenness, and their blossom shall go up as dust, because they have cast away the law of the Lord of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore is the anger of the Lord kindled against his people, and he has stretched forth his hand against them, and hath smitten them, and the hills did tremble, and their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. And he will lift up an ensign to the nations from afar, and will hiss unto them from the end of the earth, and behold, they shall come with speed swiftly. None shall be weary, nor stumble among them. None shall slumber nor sleep. Neither shall the girdle of their loins be loosed, nor the latchet of their shoes be broken. Whose arrows are sharp, and all their bows bent. Their horses' hoofs shall be counted like flint, and their wheels like a whirlwind. Their roaring shall be like a lion, they shall roar like young lions. Yea, they shall roar, and lay hold of the prey, and shall carry it away safe, and none shall deliver it. And in that day they shall roar against them like the roaring of the sea. And if one look into the land, behold, darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened in the heavens thereof. So we've got a fair bit to cover this morning. We'll try and go through it fairly quickly. I want to focus on verses 1 through 7 here. Now, we've made a very strong point last week that we are going to look at the Bible literally as we go through it. And that's what we've been doing, and that's what we're going to continue to do. And I said, unless it's very plain that the Bible says, that this is figurative, or this is a parable, or this is a song, or this is something or another, that we would look at it literally. Well, here, right now, we have an example. It says, Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. So we can see here, he says, My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. And he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it. So if you want to grow really good grapes, that sounds like what you would do. you would get yourself a very fruitful place. It says a very fruitful hill. The soil's good to grow. It's a place that's ready for the planting. It says, and he fenced it. Before even tilling and planting, he fenced it. He made it safe. He protected it. It says, and gathered out the stones thereof. Took all anything that would hinder the growth. Took out the stones. De-rocked it. It says, and planted it with the choicest vine. So he did everything he could. He found the best place he could find. He protected it. He took out all the inhibitors, and then he put the best possible vine he could find, and he put it in there, and he planted it. And then he said, and built a tower in the midst of it. So that way he could look at it, and that way he could monitor it, and that way he could watch it and keep it safe from any possible threats. And also made a winepress therein, so that way it could be taken care of internally. It says, and he looked that it should bring forth grapes. Well, that's what you would expect if you go to all that trouble to plant a garden or a vineyard or whatever you're planting. If you go all that trouble to plant a plant and expect it to bring forth some kind of fruit or bring forth some kind of vegetable, if you want a crop to come out of it, you expect if you plant peanuts, the peanuts are going to come up. You expect if you plant tomatoes, that tomatoes are going to come up. Watermelons, that watermelons are going to come up. Grapes, that grapes are going to come up. But he says here, and he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. Bad, sour grapes. Not the kind of grapes that he wanted. He says in verse 3, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Really, what else could you do to make sure that you grow good grapes? I mean, you can't massage the plant and make it grow faster. It doesn't work that way. You can't talk to it and make it grow faster. He did what he could, and he let everything run its natural course, and its natural course ended up unnatural. As from what you would expect. It says in verse 4, wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. Why did this happen? This isn't supposed to happen. That's not what is to be expected. When you go and you put all that effort into planting a vineyard and you expect good grapes to come up, and it's bad grapes, sour grapes, grapes that don't match the kind of vine that was planted. He says, and now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. And I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. So that's what he says. He says, this is a worthless vineyard. I put everything into it. I did the absolute best that could possibly be done to it, and yet it failed. So I will take it away. I'm going to make it as if it was never there. This vineyard. Now, it says in verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry. So he's judged the vineyard here. And Isaiah says here that God says the vineyard is Israel. Judah is the plant. He says he looked for judgment. He looked for these people to judge themselves. He looked for these people to live according to the law, to live according to the standards that he'd given them, and to live together and to take care of one another in that promised land. He says, and he looked for judgment, but behold oppression. And we've seen that, and we read about that. How we read about in the book of Amos that they would sell people for a pair of shoes. And we read that they didn't take care of their widows. We read that they didn't take care of the orphans. We read that people, were dejected and ostracized and without hope. And he didn't even go into great detail all of the idolatry and all of the other things that we've read about in other books. What Isaiah focused on here was the failure of the people to fulfill their obligations to one another. Not just of the priests to fulfill their obligations to the people, not just of the kings to fulfill their obligations to the people, but of the people and those who can make decisions to fulfill their obligations to one another. And they failed in that. He says, he looked for righteousness, but behold, a cry. There was no righteousness in the land. There was no judgment in the land. It was a bunch of greedy, selfish people. Greedy, selfish people who were bent, as we know from other books of the Bible, on worshiping idols and worshiping their own bellies and worshiping their own wallets. That was what they had that they wanted. That's what they heaped to themselves. And so, God kind of makes it plain. He did everything for the nation of Israel. He strengthened them during their slavery in Egypt, and he brought them out of that. He did it. They didn't bring themselves out of it. He brought them out of it. He brought them across the Red Sea safely, on dry land, and swallowed up the enemies behind them. He gave them water in the desert. He gave them manna that fell from heaven. He gave them a law that they could follow. He gave them safety after the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness when they messed up. He gave them safety as they entered into and fought their battles, as long as they followed his word. He gave them that. He gave them the land. He gave them security of their borders. When they asked for it, he gave them a king. God has done everything for this nation that could be possibly, imaginable. He's done everything for them that he would in any way be obligated to do, if you could say God is obligated to do anything. He did everything. And yet, they failed. They brought forth the wild grapes. They didn't bring the fruit that he wanted. They brought the fruit that they wanted. And it was against his will. And so he says, we'll look in very quickly, Hebrews chapter 6. We see some of this language here. Hebrews chapter 6, we'll read verses 7 and 8 very quickly. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. For the earth which drinketh in the rain that cometh oft upon it, and bringeth forth herbs, meet for them by whom it is dressed, receiveth blessing from God. But that which beareth thorns and briars is rejected, and is nigh unto cursing, whose end is to be burned. We don't, live, agriculturally as a society anymore. We have a very strong agricultural backbone, but that's really a few people now because of all the technology and all of the stuff that they can do to make the land more fertile and all of the machinery they can do to make harvest more easier. There's not as much physical labor that goes into it. And we're able to make the land more fertile using things like fertilizer, and it works out for us. But we don't live like these people lived. Most of us do not farm. None of us, as far as I'm aware, are farmers by profession. I know people in here have grown crops. People in here have done that as part of tobacco especially. That's something in this state that was the big cash crop a long time ago. And you used to see a lot more of people growing crops to make a living. You don't see it as much now. And I'm not saying that necessarily in itself is a problem, that you don't see it as much now, but we have a hard time maybe grasping some of these things because it's not in our everyday lives. If you think and you plant this thing, and you make this ground, and you prepare it, and you get it ready, and you go through all the effort to grow these crops, and it turns out to be briars and thistles and thorns, or not the fruit or the vegetable that you wanted, or it's all rotten or something, well, you don't just leave it sit there. You don't just say, oh, well, I'll try again next year. No, you burn it and you get rid of it, and then you start it over again, because there's no time to wait for next year. And that's we kind of lose that sense of urgency whenever we aren't surrounded by that, whenever we aren't in that. There's for these people there's no alternative other than to raise it down to the ground and try again. And that's what God's saying here. That's what he said in Hebrews. That's what happens. You know, you're blessed of the Lord if you can plant stuff and it grows the way you want it to. But if it doesn't, that ground becomes cursed and you burn it. You burn those briars and thistles and thorns and you get rid of them because you've got to use that same ground to try again. And so God is going to judge this nation. He's going to, purify them. And he's going to set things straight and try again. And we saw that. We've read, throughout the minor prophets. We've read of the judgments they went through. We've gone through the book of Daniel. We've gone through the book of Jeremiah. We've seen how they were taken away captive into Babylon and how they were there for 70 years and how they were brought back. And they were a cleaner people. They were a more pure people. They were a people whose mind was closer to what God wanted. They weren't a perfect people. We know that from reading the book of Zechariah. We know that from reading the book of Haggai. They had some problems still. But they were bringing forth a better fruit than what this group had. And we'll see that God will do that again in the tribulation period. He will purify those people. Not only those people, he'll purify the Gentiles too. He includes them in the tribulation as well. So he says now in verse 8, "Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth." And there are people like that back then. There are people like that today who just keep accumulating and accumulating and accumulating until they're the only one. You see people that live on these great big, I guess you'd call them estates, these just gigantic pieces of ground, and they don't till the ground, they don't farm it, they just have it. And they got this great big house in the middle of it, and they're hardly there because they're always working or doing something else. They never actually get to enjoy their time on that piece of property they own because they're always out of town on planes doing things. But they've got these great big estates just out in the middle of nowhere. And you'd have to be real up high to see where the next neighbor was. But they lay field to field. They keep accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. Or as it says here, they lay house to house. So in a city, people who just keep buying up building after building after building, property after property after property, until, they're the only one in the middle of it. He says that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. Life isn't all about accumulating land. It's not all about accumulating property. It's not all about accumulating physical wealth. It's not all about coming together either in cities and working and striving and cooperating to make the best that we can. That's not what it's about either. It's not about that. It's about serving God. But these people, they've got their minds on economics. They don't have their mind on God. It says, "In mine ears, said the Lord of hosts, of a truth, many houses shall be desolate, even great and fair, without inhabitant." Big skyscrapers, large estates, they're going to be desolate. Doesn't matter who owns them. Doesn't matter who's there. They're just going to go to waste. It says, "Yea, 10 acres of vineyard shall yield one bath, and the seed of an homer shall yield an ephah." He said the ground is not going to be productive anymore either. And so we can think about that in terms of the tribulation, or we can think about that in terms of this city here, Jerusalem. Jerusalem would one day be judged. Jerusalem was turned over so that no stone laid on top of another. And they had to go in and they had to rebuild under Zechariah. Or not under Zechariah, but under Zerubbabel. But we see here, it says, "Woe unto them." Now we're shifting gears a little bit and getting into the people, and not just the judgment, but into the people that will be judged. "Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink, that they continue until night, till wine inflame them. And the harp and the viol, the tabret and pipe and wine are in their feasts, but they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands." And I don't think this is a knock just against people who are consumed with alcohol. I think you could apply that to people who are consumed with anything. If you're consumed with entertainment, if you're consumed with with your hobby, whatever that may be. If you're placing the enjoyment of this physical life above what God has planned for you, some fickle enjoyment of something down here above what God has planned for you that will benefit you in eternity, that will benefit others in eternity, you've got problems. He says, but they regard not the work of the Lord. And I don't think that that's just, that's not just something that we can apply to ourselves as Christians. How the work of the Lord is quite literally to get other people saved, to bring forth more fruit. These people also had the work of the Lord. The work of the Lord, at their time, a lot of it was physical work. A lot of it was, you live in a hard time and in a hard place. You need to work to provide for yourself and for your family. Go back to what he told. We won't go back and read it in Genesis, but you go back to what he told Adam. That he'd have to get by on the sweat of his brow. And he'd have to go and he'd have to work the ground. He'd have to work the land. And it would be difficult. He'd have to deal with the thorns and the thistles. And it would be there, and it would be a hindrance to him. But he'd have to do it anyway. And I think that part of that is what God is saying here to this people. They've become lazy. They've become complacent. You could say the same thing about Christians today, who don't actively try to get people saved, who don't actively try to share the gospel whenever the Holy Spirit presents them the opportunity to do so. It's the same thing. It's the same problem regarding not the work of the Lord. So he says, therefore my people are gone into captivity because they have no knowledge. They have no knowledge. They have refused to learn. They have refused to put God's word into their mind, into their hearts. It says, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. And so, remember, the 10 northern tribes were taken into captivity. And I think Isaiah is also saying here that the people remaining are going to go into captivity. That captivity is something that goes along with this judgment. It says, therefore hell hath enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure. And this ought to wake people up. Hell hath enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure. And their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he that rejoiceth shall descend into it. Hell it's not just some imaginary story made up to scare people into doing better in their lives. It's a real place. It's a real place, and a lot of people are headed there. Hell hath enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure. More people than you and I could spend a lifetime counting. You'd have to count, 1,000 here, 2,000, 3,000. You couldn't count by ones and make it all the way through. You'd spend your whole life counting and not get there. You'd have to count by thousands or group them into 10,000s or maybe even 100,000s in order and count your whole life in order to get there. And you may not even do it. But God knows. He also knows how many people are coming his way too. But we don't have time to get into that this morning. It says in verse 15, and the mean man shall be brought down, and the mighty man shall be humbled, and the eyes of the lofty shall be humbled. But the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment, and God that is holy shall be sanctified in righteousness. God is going to get glory from this judgment. God is going to be exalted out of this judgment. He's going to show his righteousness. He's going to prove his righteousness through this judgment. It says, then shall the lambs feed after their manner, and the waste places of the fat ones shall strangers eat. You ever see I know Joe and Gail have raised goats. If you put them in a little tiny enclosure, a little patch of ground, and you don't give them food to eat, what happens to that ground?
It gets bare.
Yeah, it gets bare.
Hurry.
Yeah, and it's the same thing whether you're talking about goats or sheep. Sheep do the same thing. They'll pull the roots up.
Well, cattle will too.
Yeah.
Horses will.
Yep. I mean the ground will get bare and it'll get bare quick. But a specific thing about sheep and goats, from what I understand, and I may be wrong about this, is that cattle and horses are grazing animals. they'll munch a little bit here, and they'll go walk over here and munch a little bit here. But sheep, they'll sit in one place, and they'll just eat until there's nothing left. They'll eat it all the way to the ground, and then they'll move a little bit and eat it all the way to the ground and leave it, and there'll just be bare patches wherever they go. Then shall the lambs feed after their manner, and the waste places of the fat ones shall strangers eat. Lambs who have had their fill, sheep who have had their fill. The ground that's left behind is going to be left for the strangers. It's going to be left for those that are left behind. And that ought to give us an idea of what it was like when Judah was taken into Babylonian captivity, how the land was burned, how there was hardly anything left at all. And when they came back, it wasn't much better. It was almost in the same exact state, in that just destroyed, mangled state. And that's how it's going to be in the tribulation. People are going to be starving. People are going to be desperate to find food. And it's not just that the food's going to be taken up, it's that it's going to be real hard to find a place to even grow it, find a place where you can even have access to natural grown food, not just food that you purchase. It's going to be very difficult. It says, woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin as it were with a cart rope. Can you imagine, imagine that, having a cart and a rope and just dragging a cart behind you and just pulling sin in that cart along. That's the picture that's here. And that's a sad state, because that's how most people live. They don't ask Jesus to cut that cart rope for them, and take that burden off. They shoulder it and they shoulder it and they shoulder it until they die, and then it sends them to hell. It sends them to that place that's enlarged itself, to that place that's opened its mouth without measure. So he says in verse 19, so woe unto them, and then he says, that say, let him make speed and hasten his work, that we may see it, and let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw nigh and come, that we may know it. And that's one of the dumbest things anybody can say. If you're an unsaved person and you're saying, well, come on, Lord, I'm ready. Give it your best shot, God. I'm ready for you. I can take you. That's the most asinine, backwards thought that I can think of anybody having. But that's the attitude that these people have. Well, if God's going to judge us, just let him do it. Let's see it. Let's see how big this God really is. It's a very poor attitude. That's also the kind of attitude that will send you to that place, that will send you to hell, that will send you to that place that's enlarged itself without measure. It says, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. I hope that sounds familiar to you. They call evil good and good evil. In today's society, it's good for two men to live together and to have sexual relationship with one another. In today's society, it's good for two women to do that. In today's society, it's good for two whatever they call themselves, transgenders, whatever they're going to call themselves, to do that. In today's society, they think that's good. And they think it's evil for us to say, no, that's sin. No, that's wrong. No, you need to read the Bible. No, you need to come to Jesus. No, you need to be saved. And let God take care of it for you. They say that's evil. That's wrong. That's bad. That's the patriarchy. That's male chauvinism. That's your whiteness coming forth. I'm not joking. That's what they say. Despite the fact that Christians have been all colors ever since Christianity even started. Despite the fact that there were no white Christians when it first started. As far as I know, hardly anybody was white until the Gentiles got converted. The first 3,000 converts that you see at the day of Pentecost were all Jewish. Jewish people that had lived in the Middle East. If you live in the Middle East and you were born and raised there and your family was born and raised there for hundreds of years, that's not white. It doesn't matter what color it is. But that's where this comes from. So for us, even though our skin color may be have a certain lack of pigment or a certain lack of melatonin, it doesn't matter. It's not our idea, it's God's idea. It wasn't Paul's idea, it was God's idea. It wasn't John's idea, it was God's idea. It wasn't Mark's idea, it was God's idea. It was inspired of the Holy Spirit. It's not something people just made up to begin with. So whenever they say that, what they're really not attacking us. They're really not attacking America. What they're attacking is they're attacking God. And they're attacking Him, using whatever target they've picked on that day. But that's what our society's become. Evil is good and good is evil. It's okay to abort babies. It's perfectly fine. In fact, we ought to get tax dollars to help with it. That's what these people think. People, used to say safe, legal, and rare, like that meant anything. But that used to be what they would say. Now it's not even that. Now it's, you really aren't free unless you get an abortion. That's what it's becoming. That's what it's turning into. And I'm not trying to say, how evil and how horrible our country is. I'm trying to say how evil and horrible every country is. Because that's the way the world goes. That's what happens whenever you get away from God. That's where your mind goes. Good becomes evil and evil becomes good. Because Satan can start influencing things. When you get away from God, you allow Satan to start influencing it. And not even necessarily that, but you let yourself start influencing it. And as we know from the book of Revelation, Satan was bound up for 1,000 years. He didn't have to exert influence on people for people to do the wrong thing during the millennial reign of Christ. He didn't have to. It's within us. It's within our human nature to do that. So Satan has a big part of it in today's world because he is going about and he's wandering to and fro, seeking whom he may devour. That's what he's doing. But he doesn't have to do that in order for things to work out poorly. That's not a requirement. People will say, it's necessary for Satan to exist if God exists because there has to be a balance of good and evil. Well, that's not true. That's not true. We don't live in some kind of Buddhist reality. We live in God's reality. Satan doesn't have to exist. I don't think Satan had to be in the garden for Adam and Eve to sin. I think they could have figured it out on their own. And that's where you really get to the gist of it. Satan isn't responsible. We're responsible. He's there agging it on. Don't get me wrong, he is, but we are responsible. That's why we're the ones who go to hell if we're not saved. Satan doesn't take all our punishment for us. Jesus did that. We ought not to elevate Satan to the position of Jesus by thinking that he's the one responsible for all of it. Because he's not. Moving forward into verse 21, woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe unto them that are mighty to drink wine and men of strength to mingle strong drink, which justify the wicked for reward and take away the righteousness of the righteousness from him. So again, people that are wise in their own sight and prudent in their own sight, people who think they're smart, people who think they know what's going on. You can look at people in the past and see that. You can look at today, people, there's an entire scientific discipline called evolutionary biology. They are wise in their own sight. They think they have a good understanding of what's going on and how we got here and why we're here, and or the lack of why we're here, I guess you could say that. They're not living in God's reality. They're living in their own reality. So now in verse 24 it says, therefore as the fire devoureth the stubble, and the flame consumeth the chaff, so their root shall be as rottenness, and their blossom shall go up as dust, because they have cast away the law of the Lord of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. And if you think that's not going to happen to the United States, you got another thing coming. If you think that's not going to happen to the United Kingdom and to France and Germany and Italy and Spain and Israel itself, you got another thing coming. There will be judgment. Just as there was judgment, Isaiah, I believe, was specifically talking to them about the judgment that would be coming from Babylon. The judgment that would come on Judah, the two southern tribes. But that same kind of judgment is coming upon on today's Israel, in the tribulation. It's coming on whatever countries are left on earth, whether it be the United States, whether it be Russia, whatever countries exist at the time of the rapture. It could be very soon. It could be, way after the passing away of the United States and something else coming up and replacing it. I don't know. I happen to think it's going to be sooner rather than later, but, we don't have to worry about that ourselves. And I thank God for that. But we see here in verse 25, therefore is the anger of the Lord kindled against his people, and he hath stretched forth his hand against them, and hath smitten them. And the hills did tremble, and their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. That isn't enough. What's described there in verse 25 isn't enough. It says his hand is stretched out still. It says, and he will lift up an ensign to the nations from afar, and will hiss unto them from the end of the earth, and behold, they will come with speed swiftly. It's not enough that God is going to ruin this people. He's going to bring other people in to do some more ruining. As part of his judgment, he said, none shall be weary, nor stumble among them. None shall slumber nor sleep. Neither shall the gird of their loins be loosed, nor the latchet of their shoes be broken. God's going to strengthen their enemy. It says, whose arrows are sharp, and all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves shall be counted like flint, and their wheels like a whirlwind. These people are going to come in, and they're going to bring a lot of death and a lot of destruction. He says, their roaring shall be like a lion. They shall roar like young lions. Yea, they shall roar, and lay hold of the prey, and shall carry it away safe, and none shall deliver it. And carry it away safe doesn't mean, they're going to lay hold of it and treat it nice and pamper it and gentle. No. When a lion comes in and carries its prey away safe, it carries it away dead to a safe place where nothing else can get it. That's what that means. It means, and shall carry it away safe. It's not going to be disturbed in its destruction making. This army is going to be able to do exactly what it wants to do, destroy exactly what it wants to destroy, and nothing's going to get in its way. It says in verse 30, and in that day they shall roar against them like the roaring of the sea. And if one look unto the land, behold darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened in the heavens thereof. That's what this people has to look forward to. That's what the 10 northern tribes already went through. That's what this people has to look forward to. And that's what the current nation of Israel has to look forward to in the tribulation. That's what the current world has to look forward to in the tribulation. This kind of suffering, this kind of anguish, this kind of destruction and judgment. That's chapter 5. Anybody have any questions or comments?